Are refugees a threat to the British way of life? Looking at the scale of the refugee crisis, some people have expressed concern that a new refugee population welcome to Great Britain threatens the British way of life. But as we will see, this claim does not stand up to scrutiny. Let us start by looking at the numbers. The number of refugees the government has committed to taking in, 20,000 over the next 5 years, is a very small fraction of the total British population, which currently stands at just above 64 million people. In fact, even if we greatly increased the number of refugees welcomed into the country, say we quadrupled it to become 80,000, the United Kingdom would only be taking in around 15,000 refugees each year. Taken together, 80,000 refugees would represent approximately 0.1% of the total UK population. Now compare that with another social group that many feel has a distinctive identity, and politically at least, a different set of values and priorities to the rest of the country, namely the Scottish. Indeed, the Scottish population represents about 8% of the UK population. What's more, the Scottish population are formally organised, with much of their population concentrated together in one area, with its own parliament and with 56 of the 59 Scottish seats in the UK Parliament currently occupied by Scottish nationalists. And yet, the impact Scottish people have on the way of life of Britons in other parts of the country is fairly small. A refugee population, which would be a fraction of this size, spread across the entire country without much by way of formal organisation, is likely to have immeasurably less influence. But how will this affect Sheffield in particular? Any refugees welcomed by the UK will likely be distributed throughout the country. There's no real telling at this point where most refugees will end up, but it is safe to assume that no more than a few thousand will end up in Sheffield and its surrounding areas. That's possibly 100 families a year moving to our region, a metropolitan area with a population of over 1.5 million people. So refugees are unlikely to fundamentally affect the makeup of the local community. However, this is a fact we might come to regret. While the word refugees brings to mind images of boats full of people fleeing from war and other catastrophes, many refugees will be bringing extraordinary talents to this country. We know that Syrian refugees in particular are often highly skilled and likely to be highly motivated, so it's very likely that they would be economic assets to the United Kingdom, and specifically the Sheffield City region. From a cultural standpoint, history tells us that the impact of refugees in Britain is usually highly positive. From Eastern European Jews at the turn of the 20th century to Somalis in the 1990s, every mass refugee movement has been greeted with the worry that it might negatively affect the British way of life. And yet, without exception, these groups have gone on to contribute to this country in a way that adds to, rather than detracts from, British culture, giving us great British icons from Marks and Spencer's to Mo Farah. This leads us to the second point. What do we mean exactly when we speak of the British way of life? After all, there are no truly native people to the British Isles. Indeed, our best archaeologists and historians tell us that the British way of life is the product of waves of immigration. First, around 800,000 years ago, European tribes began to cross the land bridge connecting Europe to the British Isles, settling near the coastlines. Second, from the 5th century BC to the 11th century AD, Celtic, Roman, Germanic, Viking, and Norman invasions brought new populations to the region. Third, at the end of World War II, immigrants from former colonies were welcomed to Britain to support the reconstruction effort. As a result, today Great Britain is known throughout the world as a tolerant, open, and multicultural society, thereby making diversity a fundamental part of the British way of life. So one might argue that welcoming new and diverse populations is in fact a crucial part of what makes the British way of life truly British. After all, no way of life is entirely fixed, and British culture has thrived precisely by incorporating difference into its fabric rather than by hiding away from it. It would be a great shame to lose sight of this in the face of one of the world's greatest humanitarian crises since World War II.